The Christian life is all about becoming more and more like Jesus. When we do that, we're going to become more and more holy. Today, we're going to see what that looks like. Let's check it out. But hey, we are so excited that you are here today. If you joined us for Easter, this past 2 weeks has just been kind of a whirlwind of crazy. Starting with kind of like Palm Sunday weekend, we had some awesome community outreach we got to do with our local school, and we had an incredible Palm Sunday that led to a Holy Week interactive prayer experience, which is something that was new for us that we haven't done before. We had a fantastic Good Friday service, and then last Sunday was Easter, and one of our highest attendance Sunday we have had in the life of Cross Church. And it's just been an amazing time. Go ahead and clap that. And here's what I want to say with that. It is awesome. Easter is always fun. Easter is always exciting. We're clapping. Our emotions are here. But it's great to celebrate with Easter. But what's not good is just to celebrate Easter and then go back to our old lives. You see, when we celebrate, it should push us to then want to participate in what God is doing in His community and participate in what God is doing through churches across our state and beyond. And I want to invite you today, if you're like, hey, how do I be more involved? What does that next step look like? How do I get a part of this whole thing where people look happy at church, or maybe even they look depressed, but there's still something different with them, even when they're depressed? Is how do I be a part of what God is doing in our church and in our community? Well, if you're new and if you're kind of checking us out, if you've never been before, I want you to stay right after service, and we're going to have pizza with a pastor in the back. And we've mentioned this before, but come find out what Cross Church is doing. Find out how you can be a part of it, and you can see God start to change your life more and more. Well, today we are continuing in our series, Touching Holiness. And if you've been with us, we're in week 3 now. We're studying through the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. And so far, we've kind of hit on a few things that we've talked about as we've started this. The first thing we kind of started with and said that the letters of Peter, they start with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Eventually, they end with the return of Jesus when He's coming tatted up and destroying this world and building a new one. It's going to be awesome. We're not there. I'm so excited when we get there. But in between all that, it kind of calls us to live righteous and holy lives. And last week, we built on this a little bit more because we got to read about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and said that because Jesus is alive, is what we said, that we can have a new life in Him. That we can start to pursue that holy and that righteous life. And we can start to change who we are, we're not beholden to our past, but we can have something new, a new birth that causes heaven and those around us to celebrate. Well, today we're really starting this journey of seeing how does God actually change us and how do we actually live righteous lives? Because it's an easy thing to say, but it's an easier to say hey, I want to live righteously. I want a deeper sense of holiness in my life. I want to kind of go towards this, but what does that actually look like? How do our lives become increasingly holy? Well, you see, really it's about growing in Jesus and let Jesus growing in you. I have said this before, if you ever heard me preach, but I love math. And I'm, probably God should have I don't know why He decided to make me a pastor, because I love math so much. And now as a pastor, there's not a lot of math problems I use. I don't know if you notice that. Every now and then you get to a passage in the Bible and it talks about talents, and then I can do some conversion ratios to understand in dollars today or something like that. But outside of there's not a lot of math in the Bible, okay? But I love math, so anytime I have an opportunity to use some math, I'm gonna jump on it. And today I wanna, as we kind of start at the onset of this, I wanna give us a couple math equations. That's what you came to church for, right? Yeah. This is gonna be good. Equations, you know what an equation is? I'm gonna bring you back to some high school algebra right now. An equation on its basic sense is such and such plus minus divided, multiplied by such and such equals that. That's a basic equation. So I'm gonna give us some equations on how do we grow in Jesus. Here's our first equation we're gonna start with here, is that you plus Jesus does not equal you. You're like, what? Huh? Get this math out right now. And you're there's no numbers. I would this is X and Y, when you really get in algebra. But here, let me say it again. You plus Jesus does not equal you. You're what in the world does that mean? Here's what we try to do so often is we hear about this guy named Jesus. And we're like, man, that sounds awesome. And then maybe we hear about who he is in the Bible. Yeah, like, oh, he came, he's God, he lived a perfect life, he died on a cross, he raised again, this is awesome. Let me add him to my life, I want to accept him, he's my savior, this is great. And then we go forward and our lives look exactly the same as they did before. But here's the problem with that. If you go to math and equations, is the only way, say like we are one, and then the only way to get one as a result of that equation is to add 0. If you get 1 plus 0, you equal 1 again. If you take u plus 0, you get u again. But Jesus is not a 0. Instead, Jesus is a perfectly holy and living God. And when we truly add Jesus to our life, we should not look exactly the same. When we add him to us, it shouldn't just be the same old stuff, the same old problems, the same old anger, the same old this. There should be some change that starts to happen, which leads to equation number 2, is that you plus Jesus does equal an increasingly holy you. You see, if you take Jesus, who's this holy God that we're going to talk about today, and if you add him to your life, it's going to change you. It's going to change who you are as a person. It's going to change the things you want to do, the things that you have time for. It's going to change your priorities and everything about your life. But here's where we get a little bit outside of a math problem, is it's not so cut and dry and black and white. You don't just add Jesus and all of a sudden you become completely holy. Instead, it's the process, it's the journey of moving in that direction. And today, that's exactly what we are going to talk about, is what does it look like when we add this perfectly holy, amazing God, and then we start to replace more of us with more of him, and what does this look like? What does it look like to become increasingly holy? Well, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to 1 Peter chapter 1. And we're going to be starting today in verse 13. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. And this is really the heart of who we are at Cross Church, is we do what we call expositional preaching. We preach book by book through the Bible. And we believe when we do that, we get to see how God just transforms our lives and changes us. And we're going to pick up in this in verse 13, as we've got to see kind of through these first 12 verses, as Peter introduces us to this God. He talks about this Jesus that's raised from the dead, that gives us a new life. And in 13, when we kind of talk about now, what does it practically look like to be more holy and less like ourselves? The first thing Peter shows us in verse 13 is it starts with a clear mind. Let's read in verse 13. It says this, that therefore, with your minds ready for action, be sober-minded, and set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter opens this section that many will call a call to holy living. And he starts it here and tells us the first step to living a holy life, to slowly becoming more holy, is to have a clear, sober, focused mind. The NFL draft is a little less than 2 weeks away. And as a Cardinals fan, I'm very invested because we have the number 3 pick. Our entire franchise is a dumpster fire, and it's so bad. It's so bad. And the only hope is like we need to get young, we need to start rebuilding through the draft and try to fix our team, and it's probably not going to happen, but we can hope, even if it's misplaced. But all that to say is, like, if you ever watch the NFL draft on TV, and like I do, like it's set and I'm excited and reading mock drafts now, is like people are excited for it. Like you see all the people around the NFL draft, they're all like treating it like an actual football game. They're tailgating, they're getting wasted, they are partying it up. And it just reminds me, I just think it's hilarious every time I go to a football game, and I'm not much of a tailgater, you know, like games are expensive enough, and like I'll go to a game and I see the dude that like an hour before kickoff is already just drunk out of his mind. And I'm like, bro, you ain't gonna remember anything that's gonna happen in this game. I'm like, I just don't get it. Like, why are you going to pay all that money and not even know what's going on? And maybe you're like, okay, I don't get wasted before a football game. Right? I go to church. Like, I don't have time to tailgate. I don't have time for that. But it's like, maybe that's not you. But sometimes we almost approach our relationship with God that way. Is we fill our minds, we occupy our minds, we're so beaten down by our problems, by our issues, by everything that's shrouded. And then by the time we get to God, our mind is just a wreck. And we're like, God, can you fix it all? And now don't hear me wrong. We just sang a song where we said we can bring our failures to him, and we should. We can be who we are. We can be authentic. We can bring our problems and lay them at the feet of God. But sometimes that trap I think we fall in is that's all we ever do. Instead, we'll go to our families, we'll go to our work, and we'll bring our best foot forward. But with God, we're like, I'm just going to give you my leftovers. I'm fried, I'm done, I'm tired. God, here's what I'll give you at church. Here's what I'll give you in my quiet time. Here's what I'll give you in my prayer life. And God, I know it's not much. I know I'm not super clear-minded and sober-focused, but it's what I got. But you see, Peter says here is that we need to approach God, and therefore we need to be ready for action. We need to be sober-minded. We need to come into our relationship with him and ready for God to do some work. Here's a little conviction point I'll give you right now. If you show up to church, to your time reading the Bible, to your prayer life, and you're constantly falling asleep and checked out, something's wrong with your priorities. And Peter tells us here that when we approach doing God's work, we should be sober-minded, we should be clear, we should be focused, and we should be ready for action. But then he continues on, not only do we develop this clear mind, but we also develop a clean heart. Check out verse 14. He says this, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance. I love this verse, and there is a lot packed into this small little verse, but this really was kind of the main inspiration for that first equation we talked about, that you plus Jesus does not equal you. That last week we talked about how a new life in Jesus, that we have this new life in Jesus, and this week Peter kind of doubles down, and in verse 14 he says, stop acting like nothing has changed in your life. If you're gonna say that I'm a follower, I'm a disciple of Jesus, that I am a Christian, that I am going towards him, then something needs to change. I saw a meme this past week, and it said I used to be able to operate when I was, early 20s or coming out of college, that I had a 6 a.m. shift, and that meant I just had to be home by 4 a.m., right? And time to shower, clean up a little bit, and then you could go to work. It says now I don't dare think about starting a movie after 8 o'clock. At night, right? You feel that? I feel that. Don't go to bed past 9:30 or 10, then you're wrecked for the rest of the day. And there comes a time in life where you're like, you know what? I need to sleep. I need to eat healthy. I need to not sleep on a couch because my back feels like I just went through a grinder after the fact. Comes a point at your life where you're like, oh, being an adult means I am responsible. I have a kid to take care of or a spouse to care for. I have a job and something I have to do, and people count on me. And there's a point in our life where we're like, I have to grow up. And you see, Peter is telling us the same thing. He says, as a follower of Jesus, eventually our heart needs to change to where we stop acting like sinful children and we start pursuing a holy God that calls us to something better. We stop acting like children that think, hey, I got Jesus, I got a get out of hell free card, so I'm good, so I can do anything I want, and start acting like, oh, my sinful decisions have consequences in my life and in the people around me. In 1 Corinthians 13:11, Paul says the same type of thing. He says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish things away. You see, as believers in Jesus Christ, what Peter is saying is that when we make that step, there's a point where we gotta say, I know better, and I gotta start acting like it. I know that sin is destructive for my life. I'm not ignorant anymore. He says, put away your former ignorance. He says, now I have been revealed. God has shown me, okay, that's something that's destructive for my life, so I need to put it away. I need to stop doing it. I need to clean my heart so I can know what God truly has for my life. Which leads to our final part of how do we become increasingly holy is we see that we need a consecrated action. Check out verse 15. It says, but as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct. Now, this is a pretty weighty statement. He says we need to be holy in all our conduct. Like that's a high bar to set. Think about this for a second. Peter, when we kind of read this into our world today, what does it mean to be holy in all our conduct? That means we're holy when we're driving in Phoenix, okay? That means you're holy when you're trying to find a parking spot at the grocery store. That means you're holy when you're waiting in line at Walmart and someone's taking forever in self-checkout, right? Like, bro, just scan the thing and go on, like, okay? That means you're holy when your kids don't listen to you. That means you're holy when your spouse ignores you. That means you're holy when the list goes on, when that coworker is so annoying and just won't stop talking, or that other coworker decides to bring fish to the office for work, right? Like, who does that, okay? We are holy in not some of our conduct, and not the stuff that really matters, that stuff that like, that's when I need to show up. Peter says, no, we need to be holy in all our conduct. There are not exceptions here. The Bible doesn't tell us that we get to pick and choose which ones we want to do. And here, this is a point, I want you to do a little check for yourself. And I want you to convict yourself a little bit. And in your mind, kind of keep a scorecard right now, is how well are you doing in this? First question, is your mind sober, clear, and focused on God? Most of the time, consistently, increasingly. Is your mind clear? Is it focused? And is it pointed towards God? Answer it honestly to yourself. Is your heart pure, clean, and free from sin? Are you getting better at that? Or do you keep on screwing up in the same thing over and over and over and over again with nothing moving forward? And lastly, are your actions wholly above reproach and honoring to God? Consistently, increasingly. The truth is, if we probably answer these honestly, we'll answer these a no in a lot of ways. We'll say, no, we're falling short. No, we fail in that. But here's my encouragement to you. When we talk about this idea of becoming increasingly holy, of living righteous lives, this is not a sprint. And the Bible uses this idea, this analogy of running the race. And I don't know about you, I'm not a runner. Like, I used to actually run in high school. I ran a 100-meter race and 200-meter and long jump. You know what all those have in common? You don't run very long, okay? I can run deceivingly fast for a short burst of time, and then I'm done. And then I have no more in me. But the Bible talks about this journey of pursuing God. It's not a sprint, but it's a marathon. And here's what's even better. It's a marathon that is not timed and is not in competition with those around. So if someone's a little bit ahead on the race, that doesn't mean you try to take out their legs so you can catch up. Instead, you keep running at your own pace, knowing that are you making progress and getting closer to the finish line. And you see, this is how we track progress, though, in becoming increasingly holy, is our mind, is our heart, and in our actions. Are they in the right place? Are they holy? Are they pointing to God? And are we seeing change in our life? But maybe you're a little cynical. And maybe you're a little depressed right now. And it's easy to be cynical and depressed to ask, like, why even try? Like, maybe you've examined your life and you're like, it is a hot mess. Like, you ask me those questions and I'm gonna answer like super no in all of those. And it's like every time I take like 5 steps forward, I take about 10 back. And it seems like I'm not making any progress. Why even try to live a holy life? Well, I think Peter kind of knew we had that question on our minds. And I think we need to ask that is, why do we try to become increasingly holy? Because I think he knew the temptation in our flesh to ask that question. And here, as we continue in this passage, I think Peter moves from kind of the practical and truthful standards to some loving and graceful encouragement. And he's probably, I can imagine as he's writing these, he's probably like, hey guys, I know you have read what I just wrote. And I know that your failures just feel like they're popping up. I know they just feel like they're right there and they're convicting you and they're kind of holding you down. But let me tell you why it's worth this super hard journey. And the first reason he tells us is that it's the very personality of our God. Let's keep reading in verse 16. It says this, for it is written, be holy, because I am holy. Be holy because I am holy. We read a version of this verse actually in our prayer time today in the middle of our worship set, where he kind of adapts it and he says, consecrate yourselves for I am your God. Be holy because God is holy. And Peter here, he quotes an Old Testament verse. And a little bit of context of this, if you were here on the first week, we kind of set the stage in the audience for this, is Peter is writing to first century Jewish Christians. So if he quotes the Old Testament, if he quotes something that Moses wrote, that God gave him, it was like saying, hey, dad said so, so do it. Like they heard like, oh, Moses wrote that? Oh man, I better get on it. But for us today, it should still have this kind of convictional power. You see, the standard of holiness isn't just some random thing thrown out there, but it's set by the character, the personality, and literally the personhood of who our God is. He is holy. He is perfect. He sets this standard with us, and he calls us to become holy because he himself is holy. And what's so important here is Peter is saying that the standard of truth is our God. Now think about that for a second, because we live in a world that says very much the opposite. They say, I have my truth, you have your truth. I'll live by my truth, you live by yours, and it will be all great because it's fantastic, and eventually we'll all end up in heaven together, and it will be great. And Peter's like, no, that's not the God we serve. The God says that we are to be holy because he is holy, and the only way to that holiness is through Jesus Christ. And he's setting this, and by we seeing this, we see the very personality of our God. We see who he is. We see what he values. We see what he loves and what he pursues. Why do we try to become increasingly holy? Because it's the very personality of our God. But it's not only that, it's also the portion of our reward. Check out verse 16. He says this, if you appeal to the Father, who judges impartially according to each one's work, you are to conduct yourself in reverence or fear during your lifetime as strangers. You see, what Peter is saying is that God is watching. That's always a scary thing to say, right? Like, God is watching you. That's what you tell your kids when you want them to behave. Like, Jesus is watching right now. So, like, don't mess up. Or, because also our parents, your parents are watching too. And we're going to tell Jesus everything he did. But he's not quite saying it like that. But what he's saying is like, hey, Jesus is examining your life. God is watching it. He says, and we should live in fear or reverence of that. But what he also gets to in verse 17, he says that we are being judged impartially by it. You see, God rewards us for our holiness. Now, that doesn't mean a lot of times what we think it means. We're like, oh, that means if I'm a holy person, I'll get a bigger house, I'll get more money, I'll get better behaved kids, and everything in my life will work out. Well, not quite. That's why Jesus also said, when we do these things, we're not building up ourselves treasures here on earth, but we're building up ourselves treasures in heaven. And you see, when we pursue this holy life, the reward that is coming, a portion of our reward is God notices that. And that is both really encouraging and really scary, right? It's really scary when we're not doing the right things, but it's also very encouraging that when I'm grinding, when I'm trying to weed the stuff out of my life I hate, and I'm trying to become more like a perfect holy God, that doesn't go unnoticed. That our perfect Father in heaven, he sees it. He rewards it. And even though I'm here on earth and I'm still surrounded by giant jerks and they don't appreciate it, and I'm trying to be nice and this guy still, I can't stand him, and the people at your work or the people in your family still drive you crazy and you're not seeing a change, that God is still looking on. You see, we pursue this holiness because it's the personality of our God, because it's the portion of our reward, and lastly, because it's the price that was paid for our new life. Keep reading in verse 18. He says, for you know that you were redeemed from your empty way of life, inherited from your fathers, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Jesus Christ, like that of an unblemished and a spotless lamb. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for you. Through him, you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and your hope are in God. You see, Peter tells us here that ultimately We strive to become holy because it was the price of a perfect, holy God in Jesus Christ that was paid so we can have forgiveness from our sins. It was the price that Jesus gave up. He gave up his seat in heaven so that we could have a second chance, so that we could have a new life, so that we can no longer be marked by our former ignorance, but we can live an increasingly holy life set on him. I want us to step back for a second and kind of look at how this passage flows and almost look at it backwards from what we read today. He starts and he almost says that there's this holy God. There's this Jesus who paid the price for our sins. He came down to us when he didn't need to. He came down to us when we couldn't get it right. He lived a perfect life. He died on a cross. He raised again in our place. And when we pursue this God, and when we pursue this holiness, there are eternal rewards that flow from it. And as we build those rewards in our lives, we start to understand our God more. We start to know the personality of who he is. We start to become more intimately acquainted with him. We start to understand the way he thinks, the things he values. And this spills over into how we live our lives. Our actions become less sinful and our actions become more holy. We start loving people like we should instead of throwing them away like our flesh tells us to. Our hearts start to become pure. We run from the sin we hate and we pursue the God we love more. And all this allows us to focus, to be ready, to set our minds on something that is bigger than us and is bigger than our former lives. You see, this is what being increasingly holy looks like. It's not easy. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's not just plugging Jesus into a math equation and everything's fine. But it's pursuing him, asking for more of him and less of the sin in our lives. My prayer today is that wherever you're at, you take a step in this journey. Maybe for the very first time, you need to say, I'm tired of living this way. I'm tired of trying to do things my own way, trying to do things in my own style. Like every time I go forward in this, it just seems like I fail and I fail and I fail, and I need to try something new. Maybe for the first time, you need to say, yes, Jesus, take control of my life and stop trying to do this on my own. But maybe you've made that decision. You've made that choice. You've been following God for a long time. You're in one of the 20th legs of this marathon. You just keep going, but your legs are getting heavier and heavier and heavier, and you want to stop. You want to go backwards, and God's telling you to just keep trusting him. Keep following him, because he still has greater blessings. He still has greater things to show you and to use you to increase his kingdom. What would it look like if on 19th Avenue in Grover's, we gathered as a group of people, as his church, that day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year, we just asked our God, how can I be increasingly holy? How can I increasingly become more like you?